Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today I'm going to offer my opinion about the outcome of the Scot Peterson trial, so stay with me. There are people who will tell you that trials are won and lost on the evidence, and that is sort of true in some respects. And there'll be people who tell you that it's won on the basis of other things, the community's pressure and that sort of thing. At least in Broward County, neither of those seem to be the case because at least with Nicholas Cruz being able to skate by without getting the death penalty, I think that showed immense work on the part of the on the part of the defense of humanizing him into something other than a monster, which is what they did. They did a good job in that regard. Even though I don't much like the outcome there, I do think that the defense did a marvelous job in Nicholas Cruz's case. Well, with Scot Peterson, you had a much more sympathetic defendant. For one thing, he's in the 60s, 67, I think. And as a result, he's at retirement age. You're looking at putting him in jail for 96 years if he's convicted on all those counts. There are 11 counts against him. And look, I think anybody on that jury would recognize that he was probably exhibiting cowardice at the time that this all went down. But cowardice is not criminalized. This was a situation where the case was lost by the prosecution and won by the defense, and that if either one had failed to do what they did, you might have had a different outcome. Why do I say it was lost by the prosecution? First of all, the idea that you would charge this man with essentially child neglect. There is absolutely no basis to charge him with child neglect because he clearly was not a caregiver. He wasn't somebody who was providing food or clothing or anything like that to these kids. He was quite simply somebody who was sent there to do police work and take care of errant children, round up kids who should be going to school but aren't going to school. He basically was a combined truant officer and peacekeeper in that high school. And whether or not, that's the role that the sheriff wanted him to play or not, I can't tell you. But I can tell you that that was his role, and he wasn't really a caregiver. And I think the judge allowing the jury to make that determination was the right answer. It wasn't as a matter of law that he was a caregiver, and he could have been reversed if he had gotten that wrong. So allowing them to make that determination on the basis of the facts presented was a pretty smart move on his part. And frankly, I think the state did a bad job of bringing in evidence to show that he was a caregiver. In terms of the opening statements and the closing statements, the prosecution did a marvelous job. But again, the problem here is that they overstretched that statute. First of all, the caregiver issue I don't think they ever really addressed. And second, I don't think they were diligent enough at going down the elements and laying this case out for the jury. But I just think they overstretched the statute, and I think the jury saw that. Now, you have to give the jury credit. They spent 4 days analyzing this case and going through all of the evidence. They looked at the videos. I don't think there's any way you can accuse the jury of not doing its job. I think they just felt like the state had not made the case. Now, why did they feel that way? This case was won before it ever got into the court by the defense. And that is because the defense took depositions of all of these witnesses. Now, that's a pretty costly endeavor. A lot of times in trial cases involving criminal acts, you absolutely cannot get enough depositions to provide you with a full picture of what witnesses are going to testify to. But for whatever reason, Mr. Peterson did seem to have some help, or maybe he had insurance, maybe his union kicked in. But they provided the defense attorney with enough funds to go and take the depositions of all of these witnesses. And what you saw on cross-examination was the fruit of that endeavor. So they would get in and they would talk about what they saw, what they did, what they heard on the radio, and then the defense would come in and say the radios didn't work, you weren't patched through, you thought you were patched but you weren't patched. And they went through all of the things that went wrong.
That was in your state of mind as you arrived there, correct?
Yes, sir.
You also couldn't rule out any of the neighboring parking lot areas, correct?
I could not.
In fact, that was actively one of the places you thought the shooter or shooters could have been located, correct?
Yes, sir.
If I can show you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit F, and if I can approach, show us if this is the 1200 building and this is the 1300 building. There are parking lots on the north side of those buildings. Could you include that area as where the shooter or shooters may have been located?
You could.
Could you also include to the right of the 1200 building, we'll call that northeast, could you include that parking lot?
Yes, sir.
And then you certainly could include this would be kind of, how would you describe this parking lot? Because this is the one that you
That's like the main parking lot in front of the school.
Okay. Would you consider that as in play or not?
I didn't at the time, sir.
Fair enough. Describe for the jurors how large these parking lot areas are.
It's very large, sir. It's a couple rows filled with students' cars. I believe they refer to it as the senior lot.
Right. And I mean, this school has 3,300 kids. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
This parking lot is like potentially football field large, correct?
Yes.
It is wrong in many respects to blame one person for failures like what happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. The blame was all around and should have been shared. And unfortunately, or fortunately for the other people who might have had a piece of that, it wasn't fully shared. Now, Peterson, I think, could have done more and should have done more. And if that is the case, if he knows that he should have done more and didn't do more, he is already going to be punished every night when he lays his head on the pillow, because he will know that the person laying on that pillow didn't do their job. That, I think, knowing that those deaths rest on him, I think that would be worse than anything the state could have done to him, frankly. And I don't think he would have gotten 96 years even if he had been convicted on all counts. I think there would have been plenty of evidence and mitigation to prevent that. But what happened here is the defense had a way to go and pick apart the state's case because they did all of the depositions. They knew what these people were going to say, and they knew that they could get favorable testimony from each of these witnesses that supported their case. And that is probably the most important thing about cross-examination and getting depositions. You get them tied down to their story early on so they can't change what they're going to say, and then you get them to say things that are helpful to your case. Now, the theory is that the person who goes first has an advantage, but that's not always true, particularly when the cross-examination is as effective as the defense's cross-examination was in this case. And it was tremendously effective. I watched a number of witnesses where they would get up, they would talk, and then he would go through them step by step. And even though they didn't perhaps want to admit some of the things that were in their depositions, they had to admit it, they knew that, and as a result, they did that. I also thought it was very important that he did not attack the people who were victims, some of the students who testified. It's like, I'm sorry that this happened, I'm sorry this was awful, but you saw my client, yes I did, and you knew that he was there, and he'd always done his job before, right? You never had a problem with him, no. And then he let it go. He didn't attack the testimony that impugned his client directly from the victims. He went to the other police officers and that sort of thing. And then you had this sort of tonal issue with a number of the police officers who clearly did not want to be there testifying against Peterson. They were there because it was their duty. They were ordered to be there. They were ordered to give this testimony. I'm thinking of the female officer who was also a skill resource officer. She very clearly did not want to get into what he should have done or what he did do.
Sergeant, what agency do you work for?
Broward Sheriff's Office,
Now, going back into February 14th of 2018, what unit were you in?
crime scene unit.
And what was your main responsibility in the crime scene unit?
I was a crime scene detective.
What do crime scene detectives do in general?
We go to scenes and process scenes,
And by process, you mean things like
collecting
that.
evidence, photographing, documenting.
So those specific tasks that you were assigned, is that something that you did at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in February of 2014?
Yes,
Were you specifically assigned to a floor in the 1200 building?
I was assigned to a floor and I was also assigned to the hallways.
Okay, and was that on the third floor?
The floor that I was assigned to was the third floor, yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, while you were conducting your job on the third floor, did you see remnants of gunshots?
Yes.
How many gunshot shell casings did you find?
I collected 61 on the third floor.
Did you collect any other on any other floor?
I collected in the stairwell 2.
In stairwell, on what floor?
It was on the first floor. It was a 1200A was a stairwell on the west side.
Okay. So while you were assigned to the third floor and predominantly did most of your work on this third floor, you also happened to be the crime scene detective at the time that collected the two shells from the west stairwell. On the
Yes, sir.
And I think that when that shows up, the jury gets the impression, the cops are not fully behind this case. They don't really think that Peterson did anything that was all that bad. Now, I don't know that that's the case, but that's what I think. The main thing, I think the good lawyering on the part of the defendants was so superior and so effective that it defeated the very effective closing argument by the state. You also have to recognize that the closing argument from the defense was very, very good, which is why they brought in a cleanup hitter on the state. And again, no complaints about the jury. They did what they were supposed to do. They analyzed the evidence and they made a determination that the state had not made their case. We have to be thankful, even when a case doesn't come out necessarily the way that we think it ought to. We have to be thankful that we have the jury system and that the jury system empowers 6 ordinary people to make a determination about guilt or innocence. If I'd been on the jury, maybe I would have reached a different determination. I don't know. I figured you were either going to get a hung jury or a not guilty verdict. And if you watched the comments on YouTube, particularly on Law and Crime and on Channel 7, I believe it is, that had the trial streamed. If you watched the comments that were being made on those two, it was about 60-40 for acquittal. And those tend to be a pretty good ballpark measure of how a particular plaintiff or defendant is doing in a civil case, and certainly they were a good barometer here. So that's what I have for you on the Peterson trial. I appreciate everybody's time and attention, in particular your suggestions about what to do. If you have any requests for videos, please send them to me. I've listed the email address several times, but it's the same one that's in the About tab on YouTube. Thanks again for watching. Have a marvelous day, and when you have the opportunity today, do something nice for someone. We'll catch you next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.